Hello, everyone. My name is Elisa Ewan, and I am the Assistant Director of Alumni Relations at Teachers College. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Alumni Career Development webinar, which is co-sponsored by TC Next and Alumni Relations. This webinar series covers a range of career-related topics and features speakers from a variety of industries. This is one of the many ways you can stay engaged with your TC family. I'd like to quickly remind you of a few more ways you can maintain a meaningful connection with TC. 1, hire TC alumni and students. 2, refer prospective students back to the college. 3, show your pride by including Teachers College in all of your professional credentials. 4, share your talents and expertise by volunteering to speak at TC events or by joining one of our Alumni Association committees. And 5, when the time is right for you, support TC financially by donating to the TC Fund. We are especially grateful for all of the TC alumni who share their knowledge through insightful presentations like the one we're about to hear for all of the TC community to learn together. And now I would like to introduce today's events speaker, alumna Diane Brescher, who will be presenting Managing Relationships from a 360 View, Building Your Relational Social Capital. Diane has had over 30 years of experience in the field of learning and talent development. She founded DB Consulting Partners, LLC, which specializes in learning strategy, curriculum design, facilitation, and executive coaching. Her executive coaching enables leaders to better understand themselves in terms of how they think, interact with each other, helping them become more strategic and emotionally intelligent when achieving demonstrated results. She is well-versed in supporting leadership growth through effective competency management, course creation, facilitation, and coaching methods. Diane is very active in the Association for Talent Development, both at the national and local levels. She volunteers as a coach for the New Start Career Network and has volunteered as a leadership facilitator and coach for Wings for Growth, a nonprofit organization focused on developing young women leaders. Diane will be taking questions from the audience during the latter part of our event, so feel free to drop in your questions in the Q&A pane below. We will be utilizing Mentimeter during today's webinar, so please make sure you have your phone or device ready. We will also be utilizing the chat feature, and that is located at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a recording and a follow-up email. If you have any technical or audio issues, please feel free to chat and let us know how we can help. And without further ado, please help me welcome Diane.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, TC family. Welcome, TC community. It feels like it hasn't been that long ago since I graduated from TC. And the main focus of our conversation today is really on managing relationships and building your relational social capital. And this whole interest in social capital really came out of my dissertation topic, which was entitled How Individuals Transition into Entrepreneurship Using Their Social Networks. So I did a lot of studying and research around social capital. And so that's part of the work that I do today, in fact, in my leadership coaching development business and in a lot of the coaching work that I do with my clients. So hopefully you'll find our session today of value. So one of the things that we're going to really look at is what is relational social capital? What is it? What does it mean to me? We're going to talk a lot about stakeholders and who are they? How do I know them? How am I connected to them? And how can I provide effective value to my stakeholders? And the other thing that we're going to look at is how do I communicate effectively with my stakeholders? So I put a piece in our session today really on understanding communication styles and tailoring our message to our individual needs. So that's everything that we're really gonna stay focused in on today. And the heading is really called Building Solid Interpersonal Relationships. And as we go through our session today, I welcome you to reflect on your own interpersonal relationships. Our focus is on work, but again, interpersonal relationships is something that we can think about in all aspects of our lives as well. So some self-reflection exercises. I do have an exercise in here on Mentimeter, and I have also provided a handout for you all as a sort of a takeaway, which you'll get after our session. So one of the things that I thought would be helpful is really to look at where does this whole construct of relational social capital fit. So intellectual capital is made up of these three areas. Human capital, which many of you probably have heard of, it's really, as the definition is up here, skills, knowledge, experience viewed in terms of their cost or their value. So human capital is probably a fairly common construct that people know, have heard about. Structural capital is really the infrastructure, its processes, its procedures. It could be considered a database of an organization that really helps support human capital. And I put here, because I thought this was interesting, structural capital is owned by an organization and remains in an organization when people leave. Relational social capital, which is really the heart and soul of what we're talking about today, is the value inherent in the relationships that people have with one another. And so relationships they have with one another, relationships they have with their customers, their vendors, their suppliers, their coworkers, their managers, their staff, and other important constituencies. And so this slide really does speak to the fact that, again, I wanted you to focus in on this. Relational social capital is sort of the value that we have in terms of our relationships with other people. And so when key people and when people leave organizations, the relational social capital that they have within that organization can shift. Unlike structural capital, which resides within the organization when people leave. So again, I just wanted you to understand all the differences in terms of intellectual capital, which I think might be helpful. A few more tips on, as we're further diving into relational social capital, I will read to you the three bullets that I put up here. One is it consists of intangibles. So shared values, commitments that people make with one another, information that is shared, knowledge that is shared, expertise that is shared. And the other thing I'll comment on here is if anyone is familiar with sources, Raven and French's work in terms of sources of power, expertise power and informational power, as well as sort of one's personal power, are all constructs of personal power. And so to me, when I think about information and knowledge and sharing expertise, these are things that I can control to build effective working relationships with other people. And it also forms the basis within which interpersonal trust is developed. Relational social capital includes the existence of shared norms. Norms, guidelines, ways in which we can interact with one another. And it also, relational social capital also focuses on the quality of our networks and the quality of relationships that we have with others. So I'm going to pause for a moment here and just ask you in the chat pod just to call out, what are some key words that you're seeing on the slide that really resonates with you? What are some of the key words on the slide that resonates with you? Okay, so I'm seeing shared, I'm seeing some shared norms, shared values, commitments, quality of networks, trust. Lots of really good comments here. Thank you for commenting. Intangibles, yeah, commitments, relationship with others and stakeholders. Yeah, so hopefully this gives us some sense of what it is when we're talking about relational social capital. It's all of these things, folks. It's the intangibles. Sometimes it's the, how do you define trust with one another? And it's a two-way, you'll hear me talk about reciprocity. It is a two-way street, right? So to develop trust or to have trust with one another, I'm hopeful that we are also demonstrating trust to other people, right? So I think a lot of what we're also talking about here is it's a interpersonal, meaning that it's the relationships that we have with one another, which is really also considered basically a sort of a two-way street. So that's our definition for relational social capital. And I thank you all for commenting on that. I'm going to give you some examples of what it means when I say relational social capital. Building the norms, enhancing communication. One example here is some coworkers that might be discussing the latest weather patterns or something along that, or climate change, or the hurricane that we just experienced, particularly for those of us on the Northeast. Another example could be sharing information about your favorite coffee shop, or giving your viewpoints on the best new restaurant in town, or something of the sort. Another example could be maybe singing in the church choir, or being on some sort of a band. Another example could be, building a community garden. I have lots of friends of mine that are involved in community garden work. And another one could be cheering for your favorite sports team, whether it's a professional team or a local team. So those are some examples that I have to help really get us grounded in relational social capital. What about the rest of you? What are some comments that you have? I'm looking politicians that we dislike. Yes, that could be potentially another example, or politicians that we do like. Could be other examples of relational social capital. Samantha's saying work from home tips. Yeah, how to be an effective remote worker, or how to lead. I've done a lot of coaching for leaders in the area of how do I lead my team remotely? We're so used to being face-to-face. So that could be another example. Supporting each other around certain issues potentially. Knowing who to go to when we need help. Yeah, so that I would add being resourceful to other people, right? So I'm resourceful, but that would also require us to sort of anticipate needs of others, which is actually one of the things that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. Being my coachees as a practice to practice my coaching skills, if I'm understanding that correctly, Julia. Let's see, creating shared experiences like hiking or working on projects together. Yeah, I like that. Community building means a lot of different things to different people. And because we're usually social creatures, our relationships that we have with one another, and there's a variety of ways in which we can continue to develop them. Let's see, there's one more here. Recruiting volunteers from my network to mentor first gen and historically excluded young people. That's another example. So thank you everybody for giving us some really good examples of relational social capital and on building on that. So I think for me, a large part of it is just the sharing and the giving of information, knowledge, skills to help build our relationships, which thereby strengthen our networks, which thereby strengthen our communities. So thank you everybody for commenting and adding to our examples. I also thought it might be helpful for us to look at some defining terms in terms of, so that we're all sort of on the same page when we talk about networks and who stakeholders are. So first, let's talk about networks. Networks are social structures comprised of individuals or organizations that might be tied together by some element of commonality. So some common business goals, some projects that we might be working on together, maybe some shared values. So hopefully the values that I hold as a employee are in alignment with the organizational values are. Networks are also social structures that where we can link together maybe some similar vision, value, and or idea. And it's usually a stakeholder network is an interconnected web of stakeholders. And so managing your stakeholder network or networks means understanding that interdependency and working to see that each stakeholder group together, not siloed, is part of a connected network of influence, hopefully all striving for some sort of a common objective. So thinking about yourselves and thinking about the networks that you currently have within your own organizations. In the chat pod, I welcome you to think about times in your careers where you have effectively used your network to accomplish a business goal. Okay, I see them coming in now. So John says, getting support when running for a professional office. Okay. Similar to Christian at my jobs. I don't know. Maybe I'm not seeing them all. Remember just to make sure you're setting it to everyone. Asking people in my network to refer me to potential clients. Finding an internship. I invited a friend who's a life coach to do a guest presentation on leadership training to my former job. That's awesome. Opposite support, let me see here. Opposite support from my job to help a Boy Scout troop. Currently reaching out to former professors and former supervisors to reach out to potential employers in which they have a close relationship. Yeah, so that's sort of it, right? It's how do I reach out to other people who you're going to hear me use the word connectors or pivotal links. How do I effectively use my network by leveraging other people in my network to help me? And Matt's example, I think, is a really good one in terms of that as well. How else? Inviting friends to a conference we hosted. Stephen is saying internal recruitment for programs which align with individuals' interests and which deliver on tools to boost their impact and provide professional development. Nice. Relationship building is essential to my work, so I've introduced my scholars and fellows to open positions at companies. That's lovely. Invited some of my friends to be volunteers, guest speakers for your students, connecting people to others who might help them. That's the name of the game, isn't it? Thank you, everyone. Managed alliances with educational institutions for the psychological care of women victims of gender violence through volunteer and supervised work. I am loving reading all of your examples. They're so specific and they're so helpful in terms of how we are using our networks today to help us accomplish a business goal. And in some cases, it also could be also a personal goal. So thank you, everybody, for commenting on your networks and how you're using them. It sounds like many of you are using them very effectively today. So I thought that it would be helpful maybe to sort of think about our stakeholders. I know that, in the work that I do, some organizations really use the word stakeholders a lot and often, and other organizations might not be as familiar with stakeholders. So I thought it would be interesting to sort of spend a few minutes by looking at, what is a stakeholder? Who are they? What's of value to them? And then finally looking at what are some ways in which I can best interact with my stakeholders. So just really quickly in the chat pod with a Y for yes, or you could put yes, or an N for no. How many of you are familiar with the concept of stakeholders? If you are, you could say yes or Y, and if you're not, you can just say no. Okay. Seeing some yeses here, mostly yeses and a few no's. So yeah, so thank you, everybody. And the definition I'm giving you is Diane's definition. It's really not a very technical definition of stakeholder. So I'm going to open up my slide here and show you Diane's definition of a stakeholder. And this is it. It's very broadly, very broad statement of anyone who has a vested interest in or concern in the outcome. So really anyone who has a vested interest or concern in the outcome of whatever it is you are striving to do, or a project that you might be embarking on, or maybe a service that you're providing to another person. So that is my definition, very, again, loosely, broadly based in terms of stakeholders. So I'm going to ask you in the chat pod, does anybody have anything you would like to add to that in terms of stakeholder? You know, when I think of that, it's literally anyone who has a stake in it. Anybody have anything you want to comment on as it relates to the definition? Waiting to see if someone's going to make a comment. If not, then I'll move on. Typically, I think of someone with power. Very common term in education. The planet, Mother Earth, is also a big stakeholder to keep in mind. Yes, yes, yeah. Okay, everyone. Well, thank you for commenting on the stakeholder definition. There's basically different types of stakeholders. Again, just to try to keep it simple, there's what we call internal stakeholders. Internal stakeholders are those that reside within the entity. So some of you might work in academia. Your internal stakeholders could be maybe an employee, maybe a student, maybe a professor, maybe someone in the alumni office, or some sort of an internal support office inside the school. In an organization, it could be maybe an owner of an organization, or employees or staff as a stakeholder. So those are all inside the entity itself. Again, whether it's an academic institution, a government agency, a for-profit company, a nonprofit company, internal stakeholders. External stakeholders are outside that entity. So some examples of stakeholders that I put here could be customers, not your internal customers, your external customers, maybe some suppliers, maybe consultants that you might hire, vendors, the community at large could be considered an external stakeholder. For a for-profit organization, an external stakeholder could be considered maybe your stockholders. External stakeholders in some instances might be considered a trade union. In some cases, it could be considered a government agency or other government agencies that might support that particular agency. So those are some examples of the different types of stakeholders that you might have. And I have an exercise for you that you can certainly do after our session. And part of that exercise is for you to really think through who your stakeholders are. And so again, I encourage you just to think through your list of stakeholders might be broader than you're originally thinking. And so I purposely put this slide in to help us really figure out who could be good who are our internal stakeholders and who are our external stakeholders. And so now that we know who the stakeholders are, and we have sort of a defining terms around them, vested interest, I want you to think through what is of value to your stakeholders. So in other words, is what is important to your stakeholders? And to respond to this question, you could think of it several ways. You could think more broadly of all the different stakeholder groups that you might have at work, or you can think very specifically about some relationship at work that you are trying to strengthen. And then I want you to think through what's of importance and or what is of value to that person. And again, to create this, you will all be creating sort of a word cloud for us to respond to. So I know some of you might be familiar with Menti. So I put the website up there. You don't need an account. You just go to menti.com and you can use the code that's listed here on the slide, which is 569-13618. And I've opened it up for you to craft as many ideas as you want. To think about, again, responding to the question of what is of value to your stakeholders or what's important to your stakeholders. And I'm going to stop sharing for a minute and open up my screen as we wait for your responses to come in. This is always the fun part as we're co-creating, as you're all co-creating. What is of value to your stakeholders? Okay, I don't see any movement for a minute here, so maybe this is it. So let's look at this together. What shows up most is accountability, trust, and safety. Those three have not changed yet. I'm also seeing here we've got communication, we've got ethical standards, we've got employee personal development, product completion, involvement, motivation, empathy looks like empathy is gaining some profit, meeting their needs, knowledge banking, accomplishing goals, ethical standards, transparency, meeting deliverables, changes, excellence, timeliness, benefit, workload, keeping the promise, interdependence, growth, inclusion, shared vision, skill gaining, gaining skills, sharing our vision achievement, community, support, meeting their needs, timeliness, listening, diversity, innovation, adaptability, excellence, optimism, power, skills, values, leadership, information. Well, thank you everybody for commenting on that. You know, I do think it's important for us to really think through what's of value to your stakeholders. So I'm going to go back to our slide deck for a minute. So again, thank you everybody for commenting on this. This will also be included. I can also send this out to you as a follow-up after our session. Let me stop sharing this, go back into our slide deck here, and talk for a minute. So why is it so important that we know what is of value to our stakeholders? Why is this so important for us? So that we can tailor our message to them and make the communication more smooth, so we can understand and address them. Shared stakeholder informed and or centered purpose, because they judge us. Yeah, so part of the reason why we want to understand what's of value, right? We want to be also providing value, right? So in order to provide value, it's sort of like a story in a story. We also have to know what's of value to other people so that we can customize our message, so that we are providing value, so that we are seen as effective communicators and building solid working relationships with other people. So we can balance competing priorities of our various stakeholders to know if we align with them. Yeah, all really, really good comments. It is important to understand, and And then it begs the question of, so how do we know what's of value to our stakeholders? So the more you know about your stakeholders, the more you can ask them effective questions, the more you can engage with them, the better the relationships will be. And relationships are built on commonality. They are not built on difference. So we're using words like alignment and accountability, right? And some of us, just to understand more of how our stakeholders seek value and what they find of value and what's important to them, also helps with our ability to be more influential with them as well. So something else that I thought might be helpful, because this is really all about interpersonal communication skills, I thought that I would add something in our session to talk about ways in which we do communicate. And so some of us might be familiar, there's lots of different models out there in terms of communication styles. So one that's very popular is DISC. Another one that I think is fairly popular is the one I'm going to review with now, and that's called social styles. So just with a yay, why, or no, how many of you are familiar with social styles as a communication entity? Oh, good. I'm seeing some no's there. Yeah, I picked this one because I kind of feel like in the line of work I do that a lot of people are familiar with DISC. And you might not be familiar with DISC either. And so if not, I'm happy to respond to some questions on that. DISC is D-I-S-C. And so let me share with you a little bit about communication styles. So, and as I go through and sort of review this social styles communication pattern here, I'd like you to also self-reflect and think about which one of these four might you be. And at the end of the day, we communicate with all four styles. It's sort of like, which one of these four do we tend to use more often, right? So I happen to be a righty, and so I'm much more comfortable writing with my right hand. If I had to shift, could I write with my left hand? It would probably be worse handwriting than I have with my right hand. I could do it. So the key with social styles is really to understand what style you are. And the more you kind of know about this, for you to think about who are my key stakeholders, who are my primary stakeholders, what style are they, and how can I tailor and or customize my message to be mindful of how they might best respond. So that's the concept behind social styles. So I will start by explaining this. So on the top part of the diagram, you'll see, let me see if I can pull this up here. You'll see where it says, I'll do it right here, high responsiveness, where I just put my pointer. So somebody who's highly responsive might be considered more emotive than other people. The other end of the scale here is low responsiveness, which means that somebody might not be as demonstrative in terms of how they show and express their feelings. So that's the one axis. The other axis over here is what we call assertiveness. And it has to do basically with like low assertiveness or higher assertiveness. And it's basically, do we tend to ask more questions, or do we tend to make more declarative statements to other people? So an example of assertiveness might be, would lunch at noon be okay for you? That would be an example of on the lower end, versus on the more on the tell-directed side, it might sound like we're having lunch at noon. So there's no right or wrong. And again, I happen to be more on the tell side, but that doesn't mean that I don't ask questions. And if you happen to be more on the ask side, it doesn't mean that you don't make declarative statements. It's sort of, again, where your natural style might be. So you'll see here, high responsive, high emotive, and high assertiveness, high tell, would be labeled as expressive. High assertive and low responsiveness, which might mean that you're more in control and you might show up more reserved, is considered a driver. Analytical is our low assertiveness and low responsiveness. And our amiables is high responsiveness and low assertiveness. And so this slide here, the next slide that I will show you is I'll start over here on the top right, like a clock, and we're going to look at expressive. And so someone who might be expressive, again, I just put up here some behaviors that might help best describe an expressive. An expressive is somebody who shares and tells a lot of personal stories. They might be more disclosing of their feelings and their emotions. They like energy and optimism. They usually display gestures. They usually have different intonations of their voice and their tone. They're usually seen as outgoing, stimulating, and they're usually a little bit more unstructured in their approach to tasks. And if you were to look at their house or their office, there's usually a lot of personal items and usually a lot of photos. So I also put up here in bold under each of the 4 styles, a goal for expressives is just to be recognized. So when you think through your stakeholders and you think about someone, you're maybe a key stakeholder or maybe even someone at work that you're trying to build a stronger interpersonal relationship with, think about, is that person an expressive? And what can I do to foster and to build on that relationship? So just really quickly, as I go through this, how many of you might feel that you are an expressive? You can just put, that's me in the chat pod. Do I have any expressives out there? For sure, that's me. That's me. That's me too. That's me as well. Okay, I'm seeing some expressives. Okay, so we've got some tips for those of us, right? How do you best communicate with an expressive, right? So the key really for any one of these, I'll give you a little tip, is to be mindful of how they might like to be communicated with. Yeah. Okay, so those are expressives. I'm going to follow down our clocks here, if you will, bottom right, which is our drivers. So drivers, again, very highly assertive in that regard. Sometimes drivers tend to interrupt people, and it's not because they're trying to be rude. Oftentimes drivers that I have dealt with are so focused on the goal that anything that might get in their way of accomplishing that goal or finishing their sentence, they might interrupt. Most drivers, not most, I should say, maybe some drivers usually do not show, there's fewer gestures. They usually show up as more reserved. They're usually fairly quick to make that decision to move forward, to progress to the result. Drivers usually focus on being efficient. They don't want to know how things are done. They want to know, was it done? Drivers also seeks to get to the point quickly. So typically might not like small talk, might want to stay focused on the task and focused on the work at hand. So in sum, for our drivers, they are people who seek control. Right? They want to move ahead. They don't want anything to get in their way, so they seek the control. So how many of you in our room are drivers? Would you label yourself as a driver? Do I have any drivers? Going once, going twice. Okay, I don't see anybody admitting that they're a driver in the chat pod. We'll move on to the bottom left, and that's our analytics. So our analytics are seekers of evidence. They like facts. Analytical people, at least the ones that I know, are usually fairly observant. They like numbers. They like figuring things out. They behaviorally, they usually display fewer gestures. They're usually seen as more reserved. They might be slower to make decisions, and that's because they want to be right and they want to avoid mistakes. They're also oftentimes seen as logical. So they're usually good at looking at the pros and the cons, the best case scenario, the worst case scenario. So they might be slower to make a decision, but when they do make the decision, it's usually really the best decision. So who in here is an analytic? You have any analytics? Okay. I see at least one. Maybe our analytics are still thinking about it. Can you be a combo? Yes, you can be combos. So when I did this years and years ago, you're usually sort of housed in one camp or one of these four. And then you usually you're usually not a solid, let's say, driver or expressive. You probably have tendencies to be in one of the others. So if you ever do this as a, if you ever do this instrument or have the opportunity to sort of go through this, you might, I'm putting up here a star. You might be, have a few things here, but you might also show up in another area, right? So the answer is yes. So I will come up over here to the top left and look at our amiables. So amiables are, again, typically love the personal items. Amiables get along, they're outgoing, they show a tremendous amount of interest in other people. So they also tend to be slower in terms of their decision making because they want to be liked. They might wait to hear other people share their viewpoint before they share their viewpoint or their personal belief. So they're supportive, they're agreeable, they don't like discord, they prefer harmony. They don't want to really rock the boat and they want really everyone to get along. So those are our amiables. Who in here might be an amiable? Yeah, I see several. So again, as I went through this, we probably can identify with really some of the descriptors on all of the categories, right? And so again, the point of me sharing this is for you just to take a deeper dive and to think about some of the key stakeholders that you have at work. And when you're trying to build that the relational social capital with others and to build good, meaningful working relationships that are built on trust and built on respect and built on reciprocity, the more you know about what's of value to them and the more you know about their natural communication style, you can sort of customize your conversation and your dialogue with them in a meaningful ways. Yeah, I'm also looking at Maria's comment here about how I can see I can be mostly in one of these and then a combination of others depending upon the situation. Yeah, so oftentimes folks, I'm asked, are we different at home than we are at work? And I leave that question for you. I think, sometimes people act very differently at work than they do at home. And then perhaps your communication style might shift. I tend to think, though, you sort of are who you are, unless you're radically different in one environment than another. So that's our communication style. So again, this is called social styles. There's lots of information on the web, and there might even be some sort of free assessments out there that might help you kind of recognize in a little bit more detail which of those styles you might be, so that you understand it maybe in a little bit more depth. So another thing that you're going to take away is an exercise on stakeholder mapping. And the one that is on the slide here is just an example. For those of us that might be visual learners, this is sort of a mind map, if you will, of an example of a stakeholder map. So what you might do in a case like this is sort of to list out your key stakeholder groups. Like an example I shared before might be trade unions, or maybe your competitors, maybe your employees, maybe the government entity, maybe your suppliers, maybe your customers, maybe your vendors, maybe over here your staff, right? So really thinking through who your key stakeholder groups are. And then what I would do is I would label it really by a person. So if my top person I deal with, for example, at this trade union is Peter, I might actually list on my stakeholder map Peter. Because remember, your stakeholders, while they're also entities, they're also really made up of people. And you're trying to build a relationship really with that person. And so on the bottom here, you'll see I have a key. So what you might think about as you list out all your stakeholders, and again, maybe a legal size paper might be easier to do this than a letter size paper, depending upon how many stakeholder groups you have. But you could list out, are they a primary or a secondary stakeholder? So you'll see up here, I'm giving you an example. Some of your customers might be primary examples. So I highlighted that with a P. Over here, your suppliers, maybe a certain supplier group might be a secondary, so you might give them an S. Another way to think about labeling your stakeholders is that an internal or an external? In this example, my customers are external, so I give them an E. My suppliers over here are an E. If you've got a stakeholder that's inside your organization, like an employee, you might label that as an I. And the last little key here I'm giving you is how frequent is your communications with them? Is it fairly frequent or is it fairly infrequent, right? And so you would have to define yourself what you mean when you say frequently. Is frequently daily? Is frequently weekly? How are you defining frequently? And when you map out all your stakeholders, again, using the instrument I'm going to give you afterwards, you can really think through, am I spending enough time communicating and effectively communicating with my key stakeholders? So the reason for this is it's a visual, right? For you to really take a deeper dive into how you are interacting with your stakeholders. Another question you can ask yourselves is, again, is what we shared earlier, is what's of value? What's important to my customers? And so that when I'm thinking about what communication style are they, how am I communicating and what is my messaging to be? And is it going to be a face-to-face meeting? Is it better if we're going to do a video call? So again, this sort of serves as your starting point for developing and building out your interpersonal relationships with your key stakeholders. So those are some tips for all of you in terms of stakeholder mapping. So in sum, I put a quote up here by Chief Seattle. We've talked about webs before. Man does not weave this web of life. He is merely a strand of it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. So again, speaking and ending on that note of reciprocity, which I think is so important when you're continuing to develop, nurture, and sustain your effective relationships. Again, building relational social capital for you and for your organizations. So there's a comment in our chat pod. If you have any questions for me, certainly feel free to put them in the Q&A pane and I will be happy to respond to them. Oh, but before we do that, I have one final question. I know this is a lot of information in a short amount of time. So just off the top of your heads, what's one of your big takeaways of something that we've covered? What's your big aha or something that you want to stay focused on, something you may not have thought about before? Meredith is saying the communication styles, the stakeholder map. Sometimes it's called stakeholder mapping. I've also seen it called relationship mapping. And there's another thing that I want to add to the relationship map is I use the word, and when you get your handout, I use the word pivotal links or connectors. And when you map out your relationships, I want you to think about, and this was in some of the examples we used earlier, I want you to think about who in your network you can leverage as a pivotal link, as a connector to help you with a business goal. Right. So when you do your own personal relationship map, I ask you about pivotal links and connectors. And that is really thinking through who in your network can you leverage and vice versa. Who are you a pivotal link for? Who are you a connector for? And how can I be helpful for other people? Okay, so I'm looking at some of your big takeaways. Stakeholders of different values, pay attention to each. Importance of understanding communication styles, names to label my different communication styles. That's great. Appreciate the stakeholder mapping concepts and strategies, how to integrate the different needs of across the landscape of relationships. Thank you. Knowing what matters to my stakeholders and creating value. Awesome. Lots of really good comments in there. Thank you. Thank you. So if there's questions for me, I'm happy to respond to questions. So I see one in here. Should I respond to that?
So before we start with Q&A, I just want to quickly mention again, if you do have any questions for Diane, please feel free to post them in the Q&A pane below. We have a few more minutes for questions before we wrap up. So Diane, let's go ahead and go into these questions. The first question that I have today is, we kind of talked about knowing our social relational capital and the different communication styles. So I have one person who asked, how and to what extent do cultural norms impact building your relational social capital? And what do we do, and how does that affect it exactly?
So the question is around cultural norms.
Exactly.
And how does that impact our relationships?
Yes. And what do we need to do differently to ensure that we are able to build a effective and efficient relationship as it's also meaningful?
Yeah, I thank you for that question. I think the more you're curious, the more we stay curious and we try to understand others' cultural norms, particularly in this, global world we exist in and we live in and we interact with, the more we can be mindful and be curious about other norms. I think that helps develop relationships. I've said this before, I'll say it again, relationships are built on commonality, they are not built on difference. And if someone has a different cultural norm than we do, stay curious and be curious and try to understand it. Try to seek to understand from their perspective how they might be responding to things and how they might be seeing things. And I think that will do a lot for building relationships with others.
Thank you so much for your answer, Diane. The next question I have, so we've actually gotten a couple people who have reached out and they've noted that they're very much an introvert. It's hard for them to have a rapport with someone and build that relationship. And they're curious, do you have any recommendations on finding ways to be heard in your workplace if you have your team is very extroverted, or how do I stay in touch with, my network and things like that if I just am not super social?
As an extrovert myself, I will do my best to respond to that question as an introvert, because I do coach a lot of introverts. I think finding a way in meetings to express your voice. Not if your natural inclination is you don't feel the need to say everything about everything, finding something, make it a goal of yours. So at least people hear your voice in meetings. Whether your voice is you're unmuting yourself, you're raising your hand, you're commenting in the chat pod, finding a way to be heard, I think is so important. And the other tip I'll give is maybe, instant messaging a colleague if you're all virtual now, and trying to just maybe stay focused on building those relationships, something that might not even feel that comfortable for you. Being mindful of maybe we both love the same football team, or maybe both of our kids are going to soccer camp, or finding something to stay connected would be some ways in which I think might be helpful for introverts.
Thank you. Yes, finding those commonalities, super important. So we have one more question. I think this will be our last question, just because I want to be mindful of your time, Diane, and also everyone who's on the call. So earlier you were talking about the various communication styles. Are there preferred ways to communicate with the various communication styles? For example, like if someone is, analytical, what is the best way to speak to them, and so on?
Yes, and that's so then again, for those of you that are really interested in, there's a lot of stuff written out there. So yes, social styles, it's important to understand what style we are, so we better understand self, understand enough about other people so that we can better connect with them. So drivers, again, these are my quote marks. This is my broad brush statement. When you're dealing with a driver, get to the facts, move on, get to the results sooner. But when you're dealing with an expressive, expressives are much more about how was your weekend? How was this? So understanding a little bit more analytics, gosh, go in with the facts, make sure your facts are right, make sure they're accurate, because they don't want to be wrong. And when you're dealing with an amiable, be mindful of conflict and be mindful that their goal is to help support. And sometimes they need a little bit more confidence and esteem building. So be mindful of some of their natural styles, in addition to that exercise we did in Menti in terms of what's of importance and what's of value to them.
Perfect. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Those would be some additional tips.
Oh, thank you. And then just like a quick follow-up, does the mode of communication matter based off the various styles? Like, having an actual in-person meeting, or like a video meeting versus a call, or just an email, or just a ping, does that matter, you think?
I do. I think, gosh, I could talk for hours about communication skills. I think a lot of the way our messaging, particularly for the emotives, is a lot of it is through body language, which again is very culturally driven. Through a lot of it's through body language and gestures. And so it's different to have a visual versus if we were just even on the phone. You wouldn't see my hands moving, you wouldn't see my eyebrows raised, you wouldn't see my smile, although you can hear a smile, I think. But my point is that a lot of visuals, I always prefer to have some sort of a visual than a non-visual. And I think just text messaging sometimes gets so taken out of context. So I do think, to add to this whole concept of building relationships, being mindful of the mode of communication is also something for us to think about.
Thank you so much. And I completely agree. Just sometimes tone is hard to always interpret in emails or in text and things like that. So I completely agree. I know we're a little over time, and Diane, I just want to tell you thank you so much for taking the time to share how we can effectively and efficiently utilize our relational capital, as well as delve into their communication styles so we know how to best communicate to them. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us today and, responding and interacting with us and staying so engaged. We really hope that you stay tuned to our emails and our social media for details on future events, including Be Pitch Perfect Anytime, How Speaking Up Can Propel Your Career with Mimi Donaldson on Wednesday, September 29th at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. As mentioned earlier, you will be receiving a recording of this webinar, as well as a handout generously provided by our presenter in a post-event email. I know we didn't get to everyone's questions today, and thankfully Diane has been so generous, and on the screen you can see her LinkedIn as well as her email, so feel free to reach out to her. Thank you again. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I welcome it. So thank you, everyone.
Yes, we hope to see you at future TC alumni events. Until then, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank
Bye,
you,
everyone.
Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.